President Calderón, thank you very much for joining us. We have a series of questions we'd like to ask you, and I'm going to start stepping back from the Latin American region and just ask you, what conditions do you think are necessary for democratic institutions to take hold in any country, whether in Latin America or elsewhere?
Well, fundamentally, there is one sine qua non. It's impossible to have democracy and also impossible to have development, and it's rule of law. In the moment that the authority doesn't want to enforce the law, or it's unable to do so, if there is not a clear commitment with the enforcement, with the rule of law, it's quite difficult to have real democratic institutions, or if that democratic institutions could work. So rule of law is the first condition. A second one, probably most important than rule of law, is, or as important as rule of law, is to have clearly a culture, an education, collective education about the values of democracy themselves, the values of tolerance, plurality, transparency, and of course about a clear notion in the community about the right of the people to vote and the right to be voted, to elect the authorities through fair mechanism. You can have a very theoretical, very well done legal framework. However, if you have not in the community such sense of democratic culture, such sense of values, if the community doesn't embody those values and try to practice them on a daily basis, it's going to be impossible. And third, very related with the previous one, is not only rule of law and not only the values very well assumed by the community, but consequently the practice itself. It is clear that the democracy is strong in all those countries that have had as a matter of fact, a practical life, continue experience during decades or centuries about democracy itself. So that could be my first reaction: rule of law, democratic values in the community, and a long-term practice about these democratic values.
Let me ask you about the role leadership plays in making these institutions in a country take root, leadership and individuals.
Definitely, it's absolutely necessary that the leaders, formal and informal, in power or in the opposition, have a personal commitment with democratic values. It is impossible or almost impossible to understand how democracy could prevail if the democracy is broken from the top, if the president or the highest figure in town and politics is using the power of the state to break the law and to break the electoral rules, or anyone. So the personal commitment is of the utmost importance, personal values and personal practice on daily basis from leaders, again, in the government and in the opposition. And also, saying that, we need to say that any good democratic system needs to be able to resist the lack of commitment of the leaders. So how to reach that point in which the democratic institutions can resist the temptation of authoritarianism, the temptation of autocratic regimes, it's more difficult to say. But going back to your question, is the utmost important to have a personal commitment coming from the leader related with the practice of democracy in any single country.
Freedom House, the human rights organization, has documented 16 years of decline when it comes to political rights and civil liberties around the world. And Latin America has not been any exception to those trends. So looking a little more at the region itself, Latin America, what is giving rise to the anti-democratic leanings of some voters and leaders in the region, would you say?
Well, it's very sad to talk about Latin America. Definitely, we are losing democracy. We are observing how country after country, anti-democratic practices, new authoritarian regimes are appearing and prevailing. And it's even more sad to say that we have not yet the way in which we can stop them. Latin America reached a point in, we believe, at the end of the last century, that we reached finally democracy, like if democracy were some kind of a steady state, that democracy were some kind of point of arrival, that there was like some kind of happiness that we were reaching already. And that was absolutely untrue. As a matter of fact, the democracy since then has come in deteriorating. It started a long time ago, but it could be, at that time, we considered that Cuba was only an exception to democratic regimes in the continent. However, that exception is becoming the rule in the region. Then it was Hugo Chavez in Venezuela at the end of the last century, at the beginning of this, that finally his and his successor Maduro ended killing democracy in Venezuela, actually killing people protesting against their autocratic measures. And after Venezuela, one after the other, Nicaragua became a terrible autocracy. Bolivia was terrible autocracy, suddenly has a moment of hope, but again, it's coming back to authoritarian practices. And Mexico, unfortunately, is going that way. Believe it or not, the speed on which Mexican democracy is deteriorating is very, very impressive and it's scary. So what could be those factors that are provoking the success of these autocratic leaders or autocratic regimes? I'm not quite sure, but maybe an excess of confidence of Democrats from around the globe, including the United States. We didn't understand maybe that democracy, it's a practice that we need to build continuously on daily basis. Our institutions were not strong enough to resist the authoritarian temptations, and also the environment in which we are living today, that either with social nets, either with other phenomena that I cannot describe right now, but that provokes some kind of fertile soil to those autocracies. Moises Naim, a Venezuelan very deep politician or analyst, says that we are living the time of the 3P, the P of populism, in which the leaders in the political arena and the rulers try the problems as an easy to fix problems, promising very easy solutions, that problems that require very complex solution. Second, the P of polarization, in which the idea is to split, to divide the society in the good and the bad guys, to blame the opponents about everything is happening, to lie openly about reality. And that takes me to the third P, which is the P of post-truth, post-verdad, we say in Spanish. So post-truth, polarization, populism are destroying democracy. And actually, the paradox that that book of Levitsky about how democracies die is that, as it happened with Hitler or Mussolini in the last century, the people who killed democracy, it's not necessarily comes to power by a coup d'etat. they actually arrived to power by democratic means in a democratic system, and from the power from the top destroy democracy. And that is happening exactly in Latin America, with the exception of Cuba again. All the new autocracies won the elections by democratic means, and from the power once in office, they are destroying democracy in a way we were not imagining.
President Calderón, as a way of shifting gears a little bit to talk about both Latin America, but also more specifically to focus on Mexico, I wanted to ask you a question about the challenges of corruption, which we've seen all around the region, but for a long time, it's been a dynamic that has undermined the effectiveness of democracy in Mexico. Could you first perhaps describe how corruption undermines democratic ability? And then as a second follow-up to that, share with us some lessons that you learned from your time in office about trying to root out corruption.
Well, let me start with the second. During my time in office, actually, there are not what we can call big scandals regarding corruption in my government. Actually, those were the exceptions on any case that was known was persecuted, investigated. There is and there was a lot of corruption that unfortunately happened very openly at local levels, but the lack of mechanism to enforce the law, or basically the lack of political will in the parties ruling those states, did definitely impossible to deal with that. But to be completely direct with you to your questions, I have been pointed out because I cracked down on organized crime, that I was too tough in opinion of somebody, including the current president, fighting criminals and other stuff, but never ever one single accusation about corruption myself or in my government at federal level. I'm talking currently just to tell you about what is happening today. Literally today appears a new book that is going to be published very soon, or is already published today as well, in which it is demonstrated that President López Obrador were receiving million pesos, actually millions of dollars, when he was candidate, money coming from the government of Mexico City, a local government belonging to his own party, at that time PRD, but currently members of Morena, his party. Those millions, of course, were completely illegals, act of corruptions, were against the law. We have testified, we have been witnesses of brothers of the president receiving cash in paper envelopes. There are several videos with several brothers regarding that. The president himself has admitted some months ago that yes, they were receiving money, but they were like contributions to the popular movement, and it was exactly what is happening in the Independence Day when the insurgent, the heroes of the nation were receiving support. So it should be a big scandal in a real democracy and in the world, but it is not. I don't know what is happening, but of course that corruption is eroding democracy. There have been not only from the local government, but money that has been received from businessmen. It was very famous as well that the president was preaching about that we need to live a poor life only with one pair of shoes and one suit, and no more $20 in the pocket like himself. suddenly appears that his son is living in a mansion in Texas, a house worth which price could be like $1 million, and the mansion belongs to a businessman of an oil company, and that company multiplied by 5 the contracts with Pemex without any auction or licitation, just appointing directly. So directly, so very clear case of democracy. Those are affecting the rules of the electoral competition, of course, are changing the political willingness of the people, are establishing unequal conditions of the competitions. We can talk about there's very dangerous cases of corruption, which is the corruption coming from organized crime, threatening the people on the electoral day, taking over casting votes or casting boxes the day of the election in several states last year in June, and with that modifying the outcome of the election. So clearly a clear case of democracy has been destroyed and popular willingness has been canceled through the armed action of organized crime in Mexico. So those could be my comments. It's really serious what is happening here. I'm sorry if I'm getting very emotional talking about that, but it is important to emphasize how serious is what is happening in Mexico today with our democracy.
And since you mentioned the challenges that organized crime also presents for the whole country and population of Mexico, what impact would you say that rising drug cartel violence, as well as from any other actors who might have access to arms through other illicit trade, how has this affected freedom of expression, and what impact has it had on freedom of the press in Mexico?
Only during this tenure of the government, meaning since December 18 to up to date, roughly 45 journalists have been killed. 45. I believe only like 13, only this year, 13 journalists have been killed. Most of them, we suppose, in the hands of organized crime. But there are a lot of things that are happening with that very serious. One is, as long a journalist publishes an article or note that compromise the so-called the honesty of the president, he attacks that journalist through illegal ways. That was the case, for instance, of the journalist Carlos Loret de Mola, who published these videos about the brothers of the president receiving cash on envelopes for the video of the mansion of the president's son. So the reaction was to attack in the daily press conference of the president to Carlos Loret, and not only attacking him verbally, but actually publishing information that only could come from tax information, which is absolutely illegal in Mexico, revealing personal information which is forbidden to reveal, and putting that journalist under threat from the criminals, or even for a kidnapper, when Mexico, considering the level of crime which is unprecedented, it's reaching unprecedented levels today. Imagine that somebody publishes how much you earn, where did you live, what is the price of how much your house or apartment worth. So these kind of attitudes of aggression, attacks on the journalists, attacks on the press, not only are eroding the free press and the free to speech rights, but also are creating an environment in which the criminals believe, and that's my opinion, that it's like an open season to catch those journalists. And I say more than 40 has been killed in the last 3 years.
President Calderón, let me ask you a couple of questions here about the United States. Obviously, we in the U.S. are having some of our own challenges with sustaining democracy. So how might the U.S. challenges be impacting democracy in the region of Latin America and also perhaps more particularly in Mexico?
Well, it's difficult to estimate, and it's difficult to talk about somebody else's system. Actually, from a perspective in which I always respected foreign systems and foreign domestic policy. But it is clear that attacks on democracy in the United States, in particular, the events at the Congress in January, I believe last year, had an incredible impact in the perception around the globe. And that is related with the issues we mentioned. For instance, the post-truth, in which in social nets, you are able to deny very evident things and nothing happened. The outcome of that is the lies prevail, and the untrue prevail. The truth is the big victim in the polarization environment we are living, and that of course erodes democracy, erodes the legal institutions, erodes rule of law. So honestly, the last presidency in the United States created this impact in the populist regimes we are suffering in Latin America. There was a clear friendship even between former President Trump and current President López Obrador. And that trend, this kind of behavior, populist behavior, lying openly in the press, denying evident facts, actually denying the electoral outcomes, of course, erode democracy. Let me tell you that López Obrador never has recognized an electoral result that doesn't benefit to him. So the only election he has recognized in his entire life is the election in which he had won. But attacking electoral institutions, the National Electoral Institute, the electoral law, the political parties, the opposite candidates, and denying the political will of the people, of course, it's an open act of attack on democracy. That I'm talking about what was happening or what is happening in Mexico.